I stood in my grandmother's empty library, staring at a Modigliani sketch that wasn't a Modigliani at all, and realized my cousins had turned her funeral into a heist. The paper was wrong, the pencil strokes too confident, the signature placed where Modigliani never signed, and somewhere in this house worth millions, an entire lifetime of collected beauty had been replaced with lies, while I'd been standing in a church eulogizing the woman who'd taught me to see truth in art. The call had come on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks earlier. "Sophia, it's your mother." I'd been in my office at Christie's examining a dubious Renoir when the world had tilted sideways. Elena Castellano, the woman who'd taught me to see art not as investment but as frozen moments of human truth, had died in her sleep at 89. Peacefully, they said, as if that made the absence easier to bear. I'd driven straight to the Victorian in Pacific Heights, that magnificent painted lady where I'd spent every Sunday of my childhood. The house still smelled like her, jasmine perfume, old books, and the specific mustiness of oil paintings that had hung in the same spots for decades. My Uncle Roberto had been there, red-eyed and quiet. My mother had been sorting through papers in the kitchen, and my 3 cousins, Marco, Lucia, and Antonio, had been standing in the foyer looking at everything with eyes I should have recognized as calculating, but had mistaken for grief. "She wanted you to handle the estate," my mother had said, handing me an envelope. "She made it official 6 months ago." Inside had been the executor designation, notarized and clear. Elena's estate, the house, the collections, everything she'd spent 60 years assembling. The art alone was worth millions. Pieces she'd acquired during trips to Paris in the 60s, Rome in the 70s, New York throughout the 80s. She'd had an eye that transformed beauty into legacy, and now that legacy was mine to protect. "That's a lot of responsibility for one person," Marco had said, his voice carrying edge I'd ignored. He was the oldest cousin at 38, a real estate developer who'd always treated family gatherings like networking events. "Sophia is a professional," my mother had reminded him. Lucia had smiled then, that thin smile she'd perfected over 35 years of getting what she wanted. "Of course. We trust Sophia completely." Antonio, the youngest at 31, had been quieter, leaning against the door frame with his phone in hand. He'd always been the follower, the one who went along with whatever Marco and Lucia decided. He'd asked, not meeting my eyes. I'd believe them. God help me, I'd actually believe them. The funeral had been scheduled for the following Saturday at Saints Peter and Paul, the church where Elena had been married, where she'd baptized her children, where she'd prayed every Sunday for 6 decades. I'd spent the week beforehand making arrangements, writing her eulogy, and trying not to fall apart every time I walked past her reading chair. The night before the funeral, I'd stayed late at the house, sitting in her library surrounded by first editions and manuscripts she'd collected, a signed Hemingway, an annotated Fitzgerald, a letter from Anais Nin to a lover, purchased at auction in 1982. I'd touch the spines, remembering her voice. "Books are conversations across time, Sophia." I'd walked through every room that night, my phone camera documenting each piece out of professional habit. The Rothko in the dining room, purchased in New York in 1961 before anyone understood his genius. The Giacometti sculpture in the hallway, acquired directly from the artist's studio in Paris, The Tang dynasty vase in the study, authenticated by 3 separate experts and insured for $200,000. I'd locked up carefully at midnight, setting the alarm, checking every window. The house was a fortress. Elena had been meticulous about security after a break-in attempt in the 90s. Whatever else happened, I'd thought, at least her treasures were safe. The funeral had been beautiful and devastating. 300 people had filled the church, all of them touched by Elena's generosity, her wit, her fierce belief that art made life worth living. I delivered the eulogy without crying, talking about the Sunday afternoons she'd spent teaching me to look at paintings, how to see the story beneath the brush strokes, the humanity under the technique. My grandmother once told me that every piece of art is a letter from the past, I'd said, gripping the podium to keep my hand steady. A message from someone who saw beauty and needed to capture it, to share it, to make sure it survived them. I'd looked out at the congregation and seen Marco, Lucia, and Antonio in the third row, all appropriately solemn. Marco had even dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. Such convincing grief for people who were simultaneously robbing her. Afterward, there had been the reception at my parents' house. Hours of accepting condolences, of listening to stories about Elena, of being hugged by distant relatives who'd driven in from across the country. My Aunt Carla had grabbed my hand at one point, her eyes wet. "Your grandmother loved you so much, Sophia." I'd been exhausted and hollowed out by the time I'd gotten home at 9 that night. Too tired to go back to Elena's house, too raw to face the silence there. I should have gone. That single decision to wait until morning had cost everything. I'd arrived at the Victorian on Sunday at 10, coffee in hand, ready to begin the inventory process. The alarm had been off when I'd unlocked the door. Strange, but not impossible. Maybe I'd forgotten to set it in my grief-fogged state the night before. The house had felt different, though. Emptier, somehow. The air had moved wrong. I'd walked through the first floor slowly, my appraiser's eye cataloging everything out of habit. The Rothko in the dining room, the Giacometti sculpture in the hallway, the Tang dynasty vase in the study. Everything had looked right, and that should have comforted me. But something had nagged at my professional instincts. The vase was positioned slightly wrong, rotated 10 degrees from where Elena had always kept it, facing the window to catch afternoon light. Small thing. Meaningless, probably. Except Elena had been obsessive about placement, about how each piece caught natural light at different times of day. I'd moved to the library, where the most valuable pieces were concentrated. The Modigliani sketch hung in its usual spot, that haunting profile of a woman with an elongated neck. I'd passed it 1,000 times, had studied it in art history classes, had used it as a benchmark for authenticating other Modiglianis in my professional work. I'd walked past it twice before stopping, backing up, looking closer. The paper was wrong. Not the hand-laid paper Modigliani had preferred, with its distinctive texture and subtle watermark, but something mass-produced, modern. The pencil lines were too uniform, lacking the hesitation marks that showed up under magnification in the original. Those tiny moments where Modigliani had paused, reconsidered, adjusted his line. And the signature, I'd felt my stomach drop, was positioned in the lower left corner where Modigliani had rarely signed during his sketch phase. I'd pulled out my phone, hand shaking, and compared it to the photos I'd taken during my last full appraisal 18 months earlier. Different. Completely different. This was a reproduction, and a decent one that might fool a casual observer, but absolutely not the $800,000 original that should have been hanging there. The room had started to spin. I'd moved to the Cartier jewelry display, the Art Deco pieces Elena had inherited from her mother, worn to gallery openings and opera performances for 50 years. The settings looked right, the designs perfect. But when I'd picked up the diamond bracelet, the weight was wrong, too light. The stones didn't refract light correctly. I'd pulled out my loupe, the jeweler's magnification tool I always carried. Under 10 times magnification, the truth was obvious. These weren't diamonds. They were cubic zirconia. The sapphires were synthetic corundum. $400,000 in jewelry replaced with costume pieces worth maybe $1,000. My hands had been shaking so badly I'd nearly dropped the bracelet. I'd set it down carefully, my professional training warring with the panic rising in my throat. How much was gone? How extensive was this? I'd run through the house then, my professional veneer cracking with each new discovery. The first edition Hemingway. I'd pulled it from the shelf and opened it to find a book club reprint from the 90s. The binding too new, the paper too white. The Tang vase, when I'd lifted it, the weight was completely wrong. And the supposedly 1,300-year-old glaze showed machine regularities that wouldn't exist on an authentic piece. The Chagall lithograph. I'd gotten close enough to see the dot pattern of modern printing, not the hand-pulled irregularities of a real lithograph. The Persian rugs beneath my feet as I'd moved from room to room. I'd dropped to my knees, examining the knots, and found machine-made Pakistani imitations where hand-knotted antique Tabriz rugs worth tens of thousands each should have been. Millions of dollars in art and antiques, replaced with forgeries and reproductions, while I'd been standing in a church talking about my grandmother's legacy. I'd called the police from Elena's kitchen, my voice surprisingly steady considering I couldn't feel my hands. 2 officers had arrived within 20 minutes. This was Pacific Heights, where a call about a multi-million-dollar theft got immediate attention. The older officer, a woman named Martinez with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had asked, "Thursday night, 2 nights before the funeral, everything was here. Everything was real. This morning, I was at the funeral yesterday, then the reception at my parents' house." I'd started to say no one, then stopped. Elena had been careful about security, but family was different. My uncle Roberto, he's Elena's son. The realization had hit me like cold water. Martinez had walked through the house with me, documenting the replacements, photographing everything with methodical precision. At each new fake, she'd made notes, her expression growing darker. "This took serious planning," she'd said in the library, examining the Modigliani reproduction. "These aren't just random grabs. Someone knew exactly what to take and what to replace it with." "They needed an appraiser," I'd heard myself say, my professional brain engaging even as my family loyalties shattered. They needed someone to identify the most valuable pieces and source reproductions that would pass a casual inspection. This wasn't opportunistic. This was calculated. The second officer had been dusting for prints when my phone had rung. Marco. I'd stared at his name on the screen, remembering his comment about hiring a professional estate company, about how much responsibility I was taking on alone, about the timeline. "Sophia, hey, just checking in," I'd asked. A pause. Too long. At the service, then the reception. "What's going on?" "Someone robbed Elena's house during the funeral. Millions of dollars in art and jewelry, all gone." I'd let each word land deliberately. The silence on the other end had been deafening. Then, "That's terrible. Who would do something like that?" "No break-in. They had keys. They had time." I'd watched Martinez's eyebrows rise as she listened to my side of the conversation. Someone who knew what to take. Someone who had access. "Sophia, if you're implying..." "I'm not implying anything. I already told you. This is insulting." His voice had taken on that wounded tone he'd always used when caught as a child. I'd ended the call. Then I'd pulled up my security app, the one connected to Elena's alarm system. The log was clear. The alarm had been disarmed at 11:47 a.m. on Saturday, right when the funeral mass had started. It hadn't been reset until 6:23 p.m., nearly 7 hours later. 7 hours of unrestricted access to load trucks and stage replacements. Martinez had looked at the log and made a note. "We'll need to interview everyone who had access to keys." The next call had come from Lucia within 10 minutes. "Marco said you're upset about something at Nonna's house." "Missing? That's impossible. Are you sure you're remembering correctly? You've been under so much stress." "I'm a professional art appraiser, Lucia. I authenticate million-dollar paintings for a living." "Well, maybe Nonna sold some pieces. She was getting older. Maybe she needed cash for medical bills or something. She had plenty of money, and she would have told me. I managed her collection inventory." Lucia's voice had taken on that concerned tone that made me want to throw something. Or maybe she gave some things as gifts. To family, to people she cared about. I'd felt something cold settle in my chest. They had a story prepared, a defense built before the theft even happened. If she'd given away $800,000 in art, I'd know about it. I managed her collection inventory. Maybe not everything. The implication had been clear. Maybe I hadn't been as close to Elena as I'd thought. Maybe I didn't know everything about her relationships with other family members. "I need to go," I'd said. "The police? Sophia, don't you think you're overreacting? Making this a legal issue will just tear the family apart." Someone already tore the family apart. I'd spent the next week in a fog of investigation and grief. The police had interviewed my uncle Roberto, who'd admitted that, yes, Denise had given Marco, Lucia, and Antonio keys to Elena's house. They wanted to pick up some personal mementos, he'd said, his voice heavy with regret. Photos, small keepsakes, things that reminded them of her. I didn't think it would be a problem. When Martinez had asked about the timing, why they'd needed keys specifically on the day of the funeral, Roberto had faltered. They said they might not be able to come back to the city for a while. Work commitments. The neighborhood canvas had yielded gold. 3 houses down, a doorbell camera had captured 3 trucks pulling up to Elena's house at noon on Saturday. The timestamp was clear, 12:03 p.m., right when Father Moretti had been delivering his homily about Elena's devotion to beauty and truth. 2 hours later, the same cameras had caught people loading items wrapped in blankets and padding into those trucks. The footage wasn't perfect. Faces weren't clearly visible, but the vehicles were identifiable. Marco's distinctive GMC Sierra with his real estate company logo on the side. A rental truck registered to a business owned by Antonio. A moving van hired through an app, paid for with Lucia's credit card. They'd been thorough, but not quite thorough enough. I'd hired my own investigators, former FBI agents who specialized in art theft recovery. The appraiser, a semi-retired dealer named Phil Hendricks, had visited Elena's house twice. Both times when I'd been at work, both times with Antonio accompanying him. He told me his grandmother was considering selling some pieces and wanted a current valuation, Phil had said when the investigators had interviewed him. I documented the most valuable items, provided estimates, suggested which pieces would have the strongest market. I thought it was legitimate estate planning. Phil's documentation had been detailed. The Modigliani, the Cartier jewelry, the first editions, the Tang vase, the Persian rugs, even the Giacometti sculpture. Every item now missing had been on his list, ranked by value and marketability. My cousins had known exactly what to take because they'd paid an expert to tell them. The realization that they'd planned this before Elena was even dead, that they'd been visiting her house, cataloging her treasures, preparing for the theft while she was still alive, had made me physically sick. I'd spent an entire night in my bathroom, alternating between crying and vomiting, unable to reconcile the cousins I'd grown up with and the calculating thieves they'd become. The text messages had been the final proof. Marco's phone records, obtained through the criminal investigation, showed extensive coordination in the weeks leading up to the funeral. We need to move fast after the service. Make sure the reproductions are placed exactly where originals were. Remember, if caught, we were collecting family gifts Nonna promised us years ago. They'd had a story ready, documentation prepared, a defense built on Elena's generosity and my supposed ignorance of private family arrangements. 2 weeks after the theft, they'd gone on the offensive. A lawyer's letter had arrived at my office, claiming that Elena had indeed given them various items over the years, with documentation to prove it. The letters had been good forgeries, really good. They'd used Elena's signature style, her phrasing, even her preference for cream-colored stationery. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd used Elena's signature from recent documents, from after her arthritis had twisted her handwriting into something shakier and less controlled than it had been in her prime. The supposedly decades-old gift letters showed handwriting deterioration that wouldn't have existed 20 years earlier. The tremor in the signature, the slight irregularity in letter formation, these were artifacts of her final years, not her middle age when these gifts had supposedly been given. I'd taken the letters to 3 forensic document examiners. All 3 had reached the same conclusion. The signatures were traced from recent documents, probably from paperwork Elena had signed in the last 2 years of her life. The paper was artificially aged using tea staining and exposure to sunlight. The ink was modern, not the vintage fountain pen ink Elena had preferred. The entire documentation was a fraud created to justify a theft. These were created recently, Dr. Patricia Chen, the lead examiner, had told me in her office in Oakland. Within the last few months, I'd estimate. The aging techniques are relatively sophisticated, but they can't hide the fundamental problems. The ink analysis shows modern compounds that weren't available until 2010. The paper, despite the aging treatment, contains optical brighteners that weren't used in paper production before 1990. She'd shown me magnified images, pointing out the telltale signs. See here? The pen lifts mid-stroke, something your grandmother wouldn't have done naturally. And here, the pressure is too consistent. When someone signs their own name, there are natural variations. The criminal case had moved forward with surprising speed. The DA's office had been eager to prosecute. This was exactly the kind of elder abuse and estate theft they wanted to deter, especially in a city where estate values ran into the tens of millions and the elderly population was vulnerable. My cousins had been arrested in March, 4 months after Elena's death, at their respective homes in coordinated raids that made the local news. The footage of Marco being led out of his Marin County house in handcuffs had gone viral on local social media. Someone had filmed it on their phone, and I'd watched it once before deleting the link. He'd looked smaller somehow, less polished than the confident real estate developer who'd stood in Elena's foyer calculating what he could steal. They'd hired expensive lawyers, the kind who wore $1,000 suits and spoke in measured tones about misunderstandings and family disputes. The defense strategy had been predictable. Paint me as a controlling executor who'd turned grief into paranoia, who'd excluded the rest of the family from Elena's estate out of spite and jealousy. They'd claimed the items had been gifts, family treasures shared over years of close relationships I'd supposedly been excluded from. They'd produced character witnesses, friends, business associates, who testified about Elena's generosity and my supposed distance from the family. Marco's business partner claimed Elena had once told him she worried about Sophia being too focused on work to appreciate family bonds. Lucia's friend testified that Elena had expressed concern about the estate all going to one person. But they couldn't explain the security footage showing them loading trucks during the funeral. They couldn't explain the pre-funeral appraisal they'd commissioned. They couldn't explain the text messages planning the heist in specific detail. They couldn't explain why, if these were legitimate gifts, they'd replaced everything with reproductions to hide the theft. And they couldn't explain why Elena had never mentioned these supposed gifts to me, her designated executor, and the person who managed her entire collection inventory. The trial had lasted 3 weeks in a San Francisco courtroom that overlooked the same city where Elena had spent 60 years building her collection. I'd testified about Elena's meticulous record-keeping, about the authentication process, about the impossibility of these being legitimate gifts, given her documentation habits. The forensic experts had testified about the forged documents. The investigators had testified about the planning and execution. Phil Hendricks had testified about the pre-theft appraisal, his voice thick with regret at having been used. "If I'd known what they were planning, I never would have taken the job," he'd said from the witness stand. "I thought I was helping with estate planning." The defense had tried to make it about family dysfunction, about my supposed estrangement from Marco, Lucia, and Antonio. "Isn't it true," Lucia's attorney had asked during cross-examination, "that you always felt you were your grandmother's favorite?" "I was grateful for my relationship with my grandmother," I'd said, keeping my voice level even as my hands had clenched under the table. And I never resented anyone else's relationship with her. I had more access because I spent time with her every week, because I helped manage her collection, because she trusted me with something she'd spent 60 years building. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours before finding all 3 cousins guilty on all counts: burglary, grand theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The sentencing had been on a gray morning in June, 8 months after Elena's death. I'd sat in the courtroom while the judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Sandra Wu, had looked at Marco, Lucia, and Antonio with open disgust. "You exploited your grandmother's death and your cousin's grief to commit a calculated theft," she'd said, her voice carrying through the courtroom like a gavel strike. "You violated the sanctity of a funeral to steal from your own family. You forged a dead woman's signature. You spent months planning this crime, even commissioning an appraisal before your grandmother had died." She'd paused, letting the silence build. "5 years in state prison for each of you. You will also pay restitution of $500,000 jointly and severally to cover damages, investigation costs, authentication fees, and legal fees incurred by the estate." Marco had started to say something, but his lawyer had put a hand on his arm. Lucia had been crying, her face red and blotchy, mascara running down her cheeks. Antonio had just stared at the floor, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. They'd found everything in a climate-controlled warehouse in Oakland, carefully stored and cataloged. My cousins had rented the space under Antonio's business name, paying for 2 years up front. They'd planned to wait a year or 2, let the heat die down, then slowly sell pieces through private dealers and international auction houses where provenance questions were less stringent. They'd expected to split nearly $2 million. Instead, they were going to prison. I should have felt victorious, but mostly I just felt tired and hollow. My uncle Roberto had approached me in the courthouse hallway after the sentencing, his face drawn and decades older than it had been 8 months ago. The weight of what his children had done seemed to have physically aged him, carving new lines around his eyes and mouth. "I didn't know," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I swear to God, Sophia, I didn't know what they were planning. I thought they just wanted photographs. They said they wanted photographs, personal items, letters she'd written them as children. I thought..." His voice had broken completely, tears streaming down his face. "They are my children. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to think they were grieving, that they needed connection to their grandmother." I'd looked at him, this man who'd played chess with me in Elena's garden, who'd taught me to appreciate Vivaldi, who'd been one of the constants of my childhood. They spent her funeral robbing her. They forged her signature to justify stealing from her estate. The words had come out flat, emotionless. He'd had no answer to that. He'd just stood there in the courthouse hallway looking broken and old, before finally turning away without another word. I'd driven back to Elena's house afterward. My house now, technically, though it still felt like hers. The stolen items had been returned, every piece photographed and documented and restored to its proper place. The Modigliani hung in its proper spot in the library, the real one this time, with its hand-laid paper and authentic hesitation marks. The Cartier jewelry glittered in its case. the diamonds refracting light correctly. The first editions lined the shelves with their spines facing out, exactly as Elena had arranged them. The Tang vase caught afternoon light in the study window, positioned at precisely the right angle. But the house felt different now. Violated. The security Elena had maintained so carefully had been breached by family during the one moment when defenses were lowest, when grief should have protected us from predation. I'd stood in the library touching the book's spines, and my phone had buzzed. A text from my mother. "We're having Sunday dinner at our house this week. Thought it might be better than being at Nonna's place." Sunday dinner. The ritual Elena had instituted decades ago, the weekly gathering that had defined our family for as long as I could remember. How many of those dinners had I sat across from Marco, Lucia, and Antonio, laughing at shared jokes, passing plates of pasta, arguing about politics and books and art, pretending we were people who cared about each other? How many of those Sundays had they been sitting there calculating what they could take, what they deserved, how they could turn Elena's death into their profit? I'd started getting calls from other families after the trial made news. The case had been covered extensively in the Chronicle and on local news. 3 family members sentenced to prison for elaborate funeral heist. People who'd experienced similar thefts reached out, wanting to know how I'd caught them, how I'd built the case, how I'd survived the family fallout. An estate attorney in Los Angeles whose client's home had been stripped during a memorial service, paintings cut from frames, jewelry boxes emptied, even furniture loaded onto trucks. A woman in Boston whose sister had stolen jewelry during their mother's wake, replacing pieces with cubic zirconia just like my cousins had done. A man in Seattle whose cousins had emptied a safe during a funeral reception while everyone was distracted by grief and ceremony. The safe had been in the deceased's bedroom, and they'd used the noise of conversation and catering to mask the sound of drilling through the lock. The stories were horrifyingly similar. Grief exploited, trust violated, families destroyed by greed that couldn't wait for someone to finish dying before starting to steal. And always, the victims felt ashamed, embarrassed to have been victimized by family, reluctant to prosecute people they'd loved, worried about what it said about them that they hadn't seen it coming. I'd started speaking about it, first at estate planning conferences, then at legal seminars, finally at public workshops for families dealing with terminal illness and estate transitions. Funerals are high-risk moments for estate theft, I'd tell audiences, watching recognition dawn on faces in the crowd. The executor is distracted. The house is often unoccupied for hours. Multiple family members may have access to keys. I'd developed protocols based on hard-won experience, changing locks immediately upon death, installing additional security cameras before any memorial service, conducting full inventories with photographic documentation before making funeral arrangements, limiting key access to only the executor, installing GPS trackers on high-value items. Simple measures that could prevent what had happened to Elena's estate from happening to others. Some people thought I was paranoid. Others thanked me for saying what they'd experienced, but felt too ashamed to discuss publicly. One woman had approached me after a seminar in Sacramento, her eyes wet. "My brother stole our mother's wedding ring off her body at the funeral home," she'd whispered. "Switched it with a fake before the service. I didn't realize until a week later when I went to have it resized. Everyone told me I was being dramatic when I wanted to report it. Because that was the other wound. The shame of being victimized by family. The embarrassment of having to prosecute people you'd loved. The guilt of wondering whether you should have known, should have seen it coming, should have protected what mattered. Elena's estate had been finally settled in November, 10 months after her death. 7 million, more than initial estimates, because her eye for art had been even better than anyone had realized. Some pieces had appreciated significantly since purchase, particularly the Rothko and several of the first editions. A Hemingway that she'd bought for $12,000 in 1979 was now worth $90,000. I'd sold the house in December to a young tech executive and his family. As much as I'd loved it, I couldn't live there anymore. Every room held memories now contaminated by what had happened. The library where I'd discovered the theft, the study where the Tang vase had been replaced, the hallway where the Giacometti had been loaded into a truck while I'd been listening to Father Moretti talk about Elena's devotion to beauty. I'd bought a smaller place in Noe Valley, modern and secure, where I could start fresh without ghosts. But I'd kept the collection, all of it. The Modigliani, the Cartier jewels, the first editions, the Tang vase, the Rothko, the Giacometti. Every piece Elena had chosen and cherished. They were installed in my new home's climate-controlled gallery room, protected by security that would make Fort Knox jealous. Motion sensors, cameras with facial recognition, reinforced walls, a safe room with biometric locks. No one was ever going to steal from Elena's collection again. I'd stood in that gallery on a Sunday afternoon in January, 1 year after Elena's death, looking at a Chagall lithograph of lovers floating over a village. Elena had bought it in Paris in 1968 from a small gallery near the Marais. She'd told me the story a dozen times, how she'd seen it in the window and known immediately it was meant to be hers, how she'd saved for 3 months to afford it, eating cheap bread and cheese so she could spend her money on art, how she'd carried it back to San Francisco wrapped in her clothes because she couldn't bear to let it out of her sight or trust it to the cargo hold. "This is what art does," she'd said once, standing exactly where I was standing now, her fingers tracing the frame without touching the glass. "It captures moments of joy so pure they transcend time. Look at those lovers, Sophia. They're weightless with love." I'd touched the frame, remembering her hands gesturing as she'd talked, her eyes bright with the memory of being young in Paris, of seeing something beautiful and claiming it as her own. My phone had rung. A lawyer representing a family in Chicago whose father had died and whose siblings had immediately started fighting over a stamp collection worth $500,000. They'd heard about my advocacy work and my case. Could I consult on protective measures? Could I help them document their collection before the funeral made everything vulnerable? Yes, I'd said. This was Elena's legacy now. Not just the art itself, but the principle she'd lived by. That beauty was worth protecting, that culture was worth preserving, that the things we collected mattered not because of their monetary value, but because they connected us to human creativity across time and space. My cousins had seen only the price tags. They'd looked at Elena's life's work and calculated theft potential instead of seeing beauty. They'd stood at her funeral planning their heist instead of mourning who she'd been, what she'd valued, what she'd tried to teach us about seeing the world. But I'd seen what she'd actually left behind, not just objects, but a way of seeing the world, an understanding that what we preserve, we honor, that what we protect, we love, that the act of choosing beauty, of surrounding ourselves with things that speak to human creativity and passion, was itself a form of resistance against a world that wanted to reduce everything to market value. I'd put Antonio, Marco, and Lucia in prison. I'd recovered every stolen piece. I'd gotten justice in the most complete way possible. Criminal convictions, financial restitution, public vindication. Their names would forever be associated with elder abuse and estate theft. Their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined. But the real victory wasn't the convictions or the restitution or even the recovered art. It was standing in this gallery, surrounded by beauty Elena had spent 60 years collecting, knowing that her legacy was safe, that her choices were honored, that the story told by these objects, her taste, her passion, her eye for truth in art, would continue forward because I'd fought for it when it mattered most. Some families are bound by blood, others are bound by shared values, by understanding what really matters, by recognizing that trust is the only currency that actually counts. I'd lost the family I thought I had, the cousins I'd grown up with, the comfortable fiction that blood made people loyal or grief made people honest. But I'd kept something more valuable, the collection Elena had entrusted to me, the knowledge she'd passed down every Sunday of my childhood, and the certainty that when she'd chosen me as executor, she'd known exactly what she was doing. She'd known who would fight for what mattered. She'd known who would protect her legacy rather than loot it. She'd known who would see the art itself instead of just seeing dollar signs. She'd known who understood that these objects weren't just valuable. They were irreplaceable fragments of human creativity, preserved across time by someone who'd loved beauty enough to spend a lifetime collecting it. I'd stood there in the gallery as winter light filtered through the windows, illuminating the Chagall's lovers still floating weightless over their village, and understood that this was my inheritance. Not just the objects themselves, but the responsibility to preserve what she'd created, to protect what she'd valued, and to pass forward the lesson she'd taught me every Sunday of my childhood. That beauty matters, that culture matters, that the things we collect tell stories about who we are and what we believe worth preserving, and that sometimes protecting those stories means fighting the people who should have loved them but chose instead to steal them, to betray trust in its most vulnerable moment, to turn a funeral into an opportunity for theft. The lovers in the Chagall floated on, weightless and eternal, exactly as Elena had seen them in that Paris gallery window 57 years ago. And I stood there, guardian of her legacy, knowing that some things were worth any fight, any loss, any price to preserve.